welcome everybody to this session, Beyond Box Ticking, a transformative future for conflict sensitivity. It's really nice to see a good range of participation, and it's really nice to see a few familiar names on here. So if I don't get a chance to say hi to you individually, hi to everyone who knows me already, and hello to everyone who doesn't know me already. My name is Tim Midgley, so I head up a unit at Safer World, which is called the Conflict Advisory Unit. We are a small team who focus on working with a range of organizations to support the integration of capacity building for more conflict and gender sensitive approaches within the aid sector. And I'm very honored and pleased to have been asked to moderate this this session. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation. We've got we're very lucky, very honored to have three very experienced experts speaking at this session today, and I hope that there's going to be plenty of time for back and forth and a bit of a bit of Q&A, a bit of a discussion. In the olden days, when we did these kinds of presentations, at this point I would be telling you that if there's a fire drill, it's not planned, and I'd be telling you where the bathrooms are. I'm hoping that you're more familiar with where the utilities are than I am. So I won't go into that, but a couple of things just before we get started. We're going to have our three presentations, and like I say, which we hope will be followed by a round of discussions. We're going to ask if you can please put questions that you may have into the chat box, which is which I hope you know where that is on Zoom. There's also an option to raise your hand, and if you want to raise your hand, then we'll get to you and you can ask questions. We'll be taking questions after the three presentations, but if you want to put questions into the box before that, feel free, but we'll get to them and start responding to them after we've had the presentations. Before I introduce our three speakers, I think it's useful just to reflect and have a little bit of kind of background to frame this discussion and where this is coming from. And I think it's worth reflecting on what we mean by conflict sensitivity and how we got to where we are within the kind of the narrative and the practice on conflict sensitivity. The idea behind conflict sensitivity, of course, is as old as time itself, as old as morality itself, if you like. The idea that the best intentions, the practices that are done in the best intentions can have unforeseen and unexpected consequences, positive or negative. But the concept of conflict sensitivity as we know it, as we kind of really engage with it today, I would say probably emerged primarily out of some of the crises in the mid-90s around the kind of the Great Lakes and the Balkans crises, and analysts like Mary Anderson and her colleagues at CDA and many others at that time were really instrumental in helping to unpick and demonstrate how the various ways in which humanitarian aid and responses were interacting with conflict dynamics and in unexpected ways, and at times incentivizing and potentially perpetuating patterns of conflict. So this led to a period of introspection and critical reflection within the aid sector to try and unpack what this meant, and a huge amount of analysis and research going into unpacking what these unintended consequences were. And in time, this was a notion that began to gather a bit of momentum within the aid sector, with donors, INGOs coming on board, acknowledging some of these risks, and acknowledging that this is this was required quite a critical period of self-reflection for agencies. It required agencies to really think about, what does it mean to be even present in this environment, and how do we deal with the fact that that the introduction of resources or power or action into these environments is inevitably going to have some unpredictable and negative consequences. And so it was quite a transformative concept. It was quite a kind of fundamental challenge. And it took us a period of time before agencies began to really take this on board. But once they did, and there was kind of a successful effort of helping agencies to really understand these challenges, the logical next step was to say, okay, how can we, what do we do about that? How do we stop this from happening? And perfectly legitimate question, and agencies like Safer World, like you know, many of the organizations started developing toolkits and guidelines and operating principles and very good things, you know, especially the ones that I wrote. And you know, a lot of this kind of guidance was coming out there, and it coincided with a period when the aid sector was becoming more professionalized. There were more frameworks and accountability mechanisms coming in and everything. And over time, it's kind of evolved into a something that people talk about, that people accept the idea of the need to be conflict sensitive. But there's a real concern that it's lost that, that kind of core nugget at the heart of what conflict sensitivity really means has become overwhelmed by the toolkits, by the processes. Conflict sensitivity has been becoming seen as a process that one can follow. Do your analysis, look at your M&E frameworks, have inclusive stakeholder engagement processes, etc. And there's a question, I think it's a very real question, about whether we're losing that thing that's at the very heart of it, which in my mind is conflict sensitivity as a mindset. Conflict sensitivity as something that says, okay, let's stop, step back, critically reflect on who we are and what that means, and what action means and what not taking action means. And that was the kind of the kernel of the idea that we wanted to then kind of stimulate discussion about here. So so that's my spiel. That's kind of setting it up. I'm now what I'd like to do is to hand over now to and introduce our three speakers who are going to talk, who've got kind of three different perspectives on this question. And we're going to start with Rahma Ahmed, who is the managing director of Asal Consulting, which is an organization working in the Somali context, which works towards supporting Somali ownership and encouraging Somali ownership and engagement to direct the way that aid and investments operate in that country. We'll then hear from Shireen El Tarabusi McCarthy. And Shireen is a senior research fellow with the Politics and Governance program at ODI. And she's going to talk to us about the intersecting political economies that kind of guide what conflict sensitivity means in practice, and the kind of the incentive structures that direct that really direct the way things operate. And then we're going to move to Juba, and we'll hear from Ranga Guaro, who is the research advisor with the conflict sensitivity resource facility, which is a really interesting initiative in South Sudan, which seeks to bring different donors and organizations together to share experiences and learn from each other to understand what conflict sensitivity means in that context. Without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Rahma, and be great to, well, hand over to you, and I'll put myself on mute.
Thank you, Tim. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's discussion and for having me. Following on from Tim's introduction, reflecting just on this session, I was thinking through a lot about how the extraordinary amount of effort that had gone into developing a lot of the guidance and the standards and the checklists that Tim was mentioning. And to now kind of allude to them as perhaps insufficient or unambitious raised a question for me. And I think the how I make sense of it is that growth is part of the human condition, just as conflict is. And when a lot of external factors, say, particularly in the Somali context, you have militarism, aid, a lot of external actors introduced to a conflict setting. What does this mean for local realities and complexities on the ground? And also, would addressing these, anything but routine, very they're not stagnant and they're not standard issues in real time, would that require going beyond box ticking? And the answer to that is the question that we've been asking ourselves as part of preparing for this session. Is conflict sensitivity fit for purpose as a field of practice? And if we explore that from the perspective of application and the challenges of application of conflict sensitivity, I'd like to draw on some experiences from Somalia. And this may very well, however, ring truth for many, many other contexts. Alistair? So in the aspect of, from the perspective of application, is conflict sensitivity something that you do for local communities or to local communities, or is it something that you do with them? And that question resonates very strongly as a starting point because it helps us think through who's the target audience for a lot of this advice and learning. And even when it comes to shaping conflict sensitive interventions, who is it that shapes these interventions? Is it a program team that's sitting in an office somewhere? Or is it something that you're doing collaboratively with communities? And quite often, the experience of conflict sensitive interventions is the former as opposed to the latter. And this is because programs or actors are coming in as the experts on conflict sensitivity, but not necessarily the expert on that particular conflict or that particular context, which then takes us to the second challenge around a very non-contextual way of contextualizing. What does that mean? It means that we have questions to be raised then about when you come in as a new actor, who analyzes the situation, who sets the narrative. And we all bring our own biases, confirmation biases, similarity biases, whether it's around people or contexts. And some authors have called this the professional's cultural and ideological priors, right? So you come in with a particular understanding, and I've heard it a lot myself around, oh, Somalia, yeah, I don't know Somalia particularly, but because I know Afghanistan, this is the same, right? So this should work. And that honestly could not be further from the truth, because as much as there are similarities between contexts, I think each conflict and each community or society is unique in of its own. And depending on many of the external and the internal factors that collide or coincide, they take on a very different shape. So the non-contextual way of contextualizing has meant that there is a very strong preference that we've seen in Somalia where there is a particular narrative that is set by externals for externals. And there's this concept of trusting your own to tell you about this environment, as opposed to, for example, having someone local doing that. And a good example of this is, for example, when it comes to PEA, so political economy analysis that many rely heavily on in order to be able to understand the context and make decisions around how to approach conflict sensitivity, how to program around it. There is a preference where internationals want internationals to provide this analysis for them. I can be even more specific and say I've seen many examples where, you know, Brits want the British actors to do that for them. The Americans want American actors to do that. And this feeds this bias that that's the only way to reach objectivity or neutrality. And what that does is it immediately prevents from a deeper and more localized way of understanding the context. And this is a situation of positionality. And it's very difficult for us to come into a situation and not acknowledge that the positionality that we each have actually contributes to that. In addition, what we have is external values and perspective that go in to this way of interpreting and understanding the context. And in many situations, this comes through, for example, when gender approaches are being considered. And there are many examples of how gender equality has become a very negative connotation because of the way externals have introduced it to the Somali context. And irrespective of how many times this has been discussed and how much this has been analyzed and unpacked, and there's absolutely no shortage of feedback, there seems to be this insistence on, for example, using a certain terminology as opposed to perhaps not stressing the labels, but maybe just doing the work to not intimidate people. And then what you also have is, in terms of the way priorities are set, especially around gender activities, what we've seen a lot of is a prioritization of, for example, voice and agency over livelihood and for example, support to business or women in business, which quite often is a much bigger priority for the people on the ground. But there is this perception that, you know, the most absolute important thing is voice and agency. So of course, that's the place to start. Again, another external view. Now, there are a lot of what I see as non-liberating structures. And what this means is if we assume that encouraging participation, dialogue, collaboration, and even allowing for maximum contribution of people that you engage with and co-creating with them is a goal, and the approach to conflict sensitivity is not very top-down, but it's supposed to be a perspective that local actors can relate to, then we don't have a lot of liberating structures in the Somali context. We don't see much of that. It is very much top-down. And one example is language. If you take language as an entry point, quite often what we have is an unwillingness to take concepts and translate concepts, not just translate words, but translate concepts and ground them in a way that the local actors and local communities can really understand. Another is around who holds the knowledge and resources. Quite often, we also see that when it comes to passing on knowledge, this is not necessarily done with a perspective in mind that perhaps that knowledge is best coming from someone that can relate more closely to the local communities, i.e., you would rather have a Somali relaying knowledge than an international, because you have the issue of language. Even if you get a translator in, you create this great distance, but also it doesn't encourage for people to engage. I mean, I've seen numerous trainings and workshops held in English, and it's not the fact that you don't have enough people who necessarily understand English. It's just there is a very, very different dynamic when people are allowed to engage in their own language. And I think having more of these liberating structures, with language being one of them, but also looking at who holds the knowledge and the resources to be able to engage people would go a long way. Donor expectations and aid dynamics contribute a lot to the challenge of application. We have the issue of idealism versus realism. Idealism around this is a policy, this is how we would like to see things play out, but then reality kicks in and actors are running around who focused on the business of winning bids versus the reality of making a difference, organizational goals versus individual goals. And the fact that there is an extraordinary amount of pressure on actors or implementing actors to demonstrate a change for the better since they arrived because of their presence. Now, what this does is it also skews the learning. It skews a lot of what is being reported in terms of how much impact has been had because of the fact that there is this aid dynamic that is quite competitive and there are donor expectations that have been set. The power structures that also come with the aid dynamics means that the role of localization has not been very meaningful. Partnerships are also not very meaningful. And quite often, when it comes to the right way of doing things, it requires time. And programs, as we all know, often work against artificial timelines, perhaps inflexible budgets, and have it very difficult to adapt, especially within conflict settings. So I think there's a lot around donor expectations that need to be reset. So let's look at what that could look like, a more transformative approach. Alistair? Yeah. So does conflict sensitivity have the potential to play a more transformative role in shaping the way international aid and investment is played in conflict and is employed in conflict settings? Now, no one can come from the outside to create peace or changes to a society, to how a society behaves within itself. Societies change from within. And as such, an expanding conflict sensitivity from a programmatic goal to a societal aspiration is a necessity. This cannot be something that sits with a program or with a particular donor if it does not cascade down to being something that societies do want to understand or strive towards. Then it'll be very difficult to have, to see a lot of transformation. Now, what would this look like in practice? A real partnership with the communities we serve, a shared definition of what conflict sensitivity interventions would look like in their particular community against that specific program. I'll give you an example. For example, one of the challenges that we've often seen within the Somali setting is there are many negative perceptions of aid and the dynamics that aid has created. And quite often we see that the communities or the general public are not always clear on why a program or an agency or an actor makes decisions in the way that they make the decisions. And this can be anything from hiring to the type of activities that they do, etc. And so people find their own ways to explain some of this, and this often fuels the conflict. For example, an explanation that I've seen quite often is, well, that particular implementer, they have X, the majority of people working from that with that agency are from Clan X. For that reason, this is why they're programming in this way. And engagement and an understanding of what conflict sensitivity would mean for that particular program would actually help those in decision-making understand what it is that the community that they're working with is sensitive towards. Another thing is incentivizing transformative approaches. And this is more on the donor perspective. Donors have a great deal of power and influence to set the tone of implementation, And during a journey of exploring a transformative role for conflict sensitivity, namely through trial and error, but also through dialogue, this is where donors, I think, can not only help set expectations, but really in terms of follow through and what this means in practice, where they can create the incentives that allows for agencies and implementers to take more risks and be more intuitive in the way they engage in various contexts. Of course, research and best practices play a part, but this is provided that research in itself doesn't fall into the previously mentioned pitfalls of being one-dimensional, i.e. an external actor coming in and studying people of a certain context and kind of coming up with all the answers. Strengthening partnerships with government and educational institutions, civil society, community leaders. The earliest lessons that you're taught, that are taught to civil servants, are about the politics of aid at country level, agency level, and program level. And an overwhelming focus is on how to access aid as opposed to how to make it work for people. Now, in partnering with government, to note, it's that the political driven approaches can never be course corrected at programmatic level. And an example of this is, so in Somalia, there's been some donor commitment recently to work through the central government, but they didn't set the conditionalities of depoliticizing the flow of aid and support to the peripheries. So what is happening is that it's becoming a very politicized tool, and instantly aid is a tool for the center to kind of use in their politics and in their way of doing things. And that means that when you have donors looking towards implementers for a solution at the implementation level or at the technical level, that becomes a big exercise in vain, because of course that can't be addressed at that level. And part of partnering with educational institutions also includes learning and teaching about the concept of conflict sensitivity. Again, this is something that is maybe closely guarded, maybe by on purpose, I don't know, but it's just not something that is being transferred. And educational institutions can play a big role in doing that. And with civil society and elders, I think it's about placing them at the center of driving the application of conflict sensitivities within their respective communities. Respecting and recognizing the potential role of religion as a powerful tool for good. Now, this is something I intentionally want to touch on, knowing that it is perhaps something that raises some eyebrows. The very definition of conflict sensitivity has been, is that there's an understanding of the context that you're operating in, and that you understand intergroup tensions and the divisive issues, but also to recognize the connecting issues with the potential of mitigating conflict, right? And strengthening social cohesion. In many, many societies, religion plays a significant role, and this can be used as a powerful tool for good. An overwhelming example of this is how campaigns against specific types of FGM has been tackled in Somalia, and the positive results that's been produced because they have been rooted in an understanding of religion. Now, regretfully, the aid sector has a preferential leaning towards secularism. However, it wants to be successful in many societies where the separation of civic affairs and religion doesn't exist. I'm of course not referring to the drive and motivation of faith-based organizations, but rather the religiosity and worldview of the recipient communities. And a transformative approach to conflict sensitivity would, in my view, require harnessing and anchoring our work in the social fabric of the communities we serve. And that is very often we're willing to do when it comes to customs and culture. I'll conclude with a couple of recommendations. So the recommendations are pretty much a combination of what I've already spoken about, contextualizing conflict sensitivity in every setting. This means giving meaning to the words and building on local concepts. Very important not to assume the context are all alike, irrespective of similarities, but also rethinking positionality and whose narratives it is that is introducing you as an individual and as an organization to that context. Taking localization seriously. I know one of my colleagues will talk a bit more about that as well. and creating, of course, a space to instill that ownership. Last but not least, I think stressing the personal nature of working in a conflict setting. Now, no matter how much one tries to kind of distance themselves, there's a very personal aspect of working in a conflict setting. So treating it as any other job just is impossible. And asking each other and our teams, why are we here, is a big part of acknowledging that also the first step to collectively exploring what we should be doing differently, i.e. transformative approaches, etc., requires that we acknowledge that. And in terms of how we think about conflict settings, where your work, conflict settings being something that can play out everywhere, there's, and I'll conclude with this, there is a Lebanese American poet called Khalil Gibran, and he has a poem on crime and punishment. He talks about how he said that even as the holy and the righteous cannot rise beyond the highest, which is in each one of you, so the wicked and the weak cannot fall lower than the lowest, which is in you also. So what I believe that means is it's true for societies also that are afflicted with conflict. And the conflict we see in the other side of the world, I think it's a reminder that the wicked and the weak cannot fall lower than the lowest, which is possible in all societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rahma. That was great, really interesting and really kind of important perspectives in there. And I'm not going to try and add anything to that other than to invite Shireen to take the floor, take the screen, and over to you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Rahma. This is a difficult act to follow, frankly. I think it was a great presentation. And so basically, when I was asked to speak on this topic, I had two reactions to it. One is that there's a lot of literature and there's a lot of analysis that's been written on conflict sensitivity. There's a lot of criticism that's already been put together to address various dimensions of why conflict sensitivity has not worked, why it's not working. And so I thought, well, what can I say that is going to be new or that is going to be different? And I took a further step back and I started thinking that maybe the problem is also with the concept itself of conflict sensitivity, that it doesn't go far enough. And frankly, based on my engagement in a number of conflict-affected contexts, I think sensitivity just doesn't go far enough. What you really need is not to be sensitive to a conflict, because it implies a detachment that might not be right, might not be morally even acceptable. Because think of it that way, if you were a surgeon and you're about to perform a surgery in an operation room, can you just be sensitive or just knowledgeable of how the surgery is going to go? You need to be immersed in it. You need to know this is what you're going to do. This is the problem with the patient. This is how you're going to address it if something goes wrong. And so perhaps, and this is something that I'm just putting forward and hoping to discuss further through my presentation, perhaps it's not conflict sensitivity that we need. What we need is conflict immersion. We really need to raise the bar of the level of accountability and responsibility that comes with engaging in different contexts, in contexts that are affected by crises, that are affected by conflict. That what we need is not just to be sensitive to them. It's not a detached form of engagement. It is an immersion. It's an acceptance of and a realization of the responsibility that comes with engaging in conflict zone and in conflict affected contexts more generally. So my presentation is essentially going to look at some of the issues related to that concept, the aspiration of conflict sensitivity and the reality of it, which I believe falls short of an already low bar that we've set ourselves. and to discuss the political economy of conflict sensitivity, and how to go from there, and is there really an opportunity for a transformative future? So this is a picture that was circulated in 2020, and I really think it's a great representation. It's a good representation of the different sectors that engage in conflict affected context. You've got, you know, the development actors on one end, you've got the humanitarians on the other, the humanitarian crisis kind of gaping in the middle, and then you've got the donors, you know, on the sides, kind of cheering and rooting and pushing humanitarians and development actors on. And then you've got that little unicorn that is peace and security, right? They're really kind of somewhat fluffy terms that they're very difficult to grasp, very difficult to attain and understand in a concrete way. And it really is a representation of just how just difficult it is to grasp how those different actors engage with one another, and primarily also how they engage with local actors, and the difficulties of practically and meaningfully instituting a nexus and a multi-sectoral approach that puts at the heart of any form engagement the conflict itself, the affected population itself, right? So you've got that very messed up, very messy kind of situation. So after sharing that image with you and after introducing my own personal take on what conflict sensitivity is and where it falls short, I think conflict sensitivity is about understanding the political economy, that really what we're talking about are two political economies. It's the political economy of the context in which we're operating in, right, in which we engage as humanitarian development or peace actors. But it's also, and it's about being aware of that engaging in any conflict-affected context will interact with that conflict, and that interaction will have consequences, and those consequences can be positive, and they can also be negative. But we often forget that conflict sensitivity is also a political economy of its own, and I think that's one key message or one key idea that I want to put forward through my presentations, that what you were really witnessing, and a lot of the problems that come with conflict sensitivity, a lot of its limitations, actually results from the intersection of two political economies. The first political economy is that of the context. It's a very complex political economy that needs proper understanding, contextualization, and analysis. But it's also, it requires a self-reflexivity, you know, and a capacity to reflect on ourselves as international actors engaging in those contexts, in the different sectors operating in those conflict-affected contexts. So reflecting on years of research in conflict and security, I want to outline the key, or from my perspective, obviously, the key challenges and dilemmas that face conflict-sensitive approaches, both from a local and international perspective, and then put forward some ideas for opportunities for a transformative future for conflict sensitivity. So about the dilemmas. The first set of, so the dilemmas about conflict sensitivity, there are three. One is to engage or not to engage, and how. So conflicts are really political, and the practice and uptake of conflict sensitivity, they're political acts too. So for international organizations engaging in a conflict, engaging in a conflict zone based in a humanitarian or development operation or a peace operation, there's always the question of how far do you go? What do you do in the reality of the conflict itself? As a humanitarian actor, for example, within the context of Yemen, you're faced with an existential crisis. You're in a situation where, for your capacity to continue operating in various regions, your very principles as a humanitarian actor are put to question, because you're not able to operate without engaging different political actors on the ground. And how do you engage with them? And in what capacity? What are the consequences of that engagement? Those are all questions, and all, frankly, are dilemmas for international actors operating in conflict zones. And the lines of demarcation, we speak to international actors, the lines of demarcation that separate right from wrong, engaging in straightforward and head-on, or to completely disengage and take a step back and do nothing about it. They're really they're very fluid, and they're very critical, and they are difficult decisions that need to be made. The other dilemma is to communicate with communities or not. Now, obviously, a response to that for everyone listening to this will be, of course, communicate with communities. Of course, you need to have very strong, robust communication engagements, community engagement tools, and you need to be there on the ground talking to them. Actually, one recent study that I did in community engagement tools in Yemen in particular showed that local actors who have been at the receiving end of communication with international actors, when they communicate with them and they don't see any action followed or any change in the response, they get frustrated. So if you want to communicate, yes, do by all means, but unless you're able to follow through with that communication into meaningful actions, a meaningful shift in your program, in your strategy, in your decision making, then what you're actually doing is counterproductive, because all you're doing is you're raising the hopes of people that there will be a change, and there will be a response to their needs. And when that doesn't happen, the anger and the frustration only expands. And finally, to cooperate or not to cooperate. And here, this is about cooperating as international aid agencies. Do we, as humanitarians, work with the development and the peace actors and human rights actors, or do we not? And that is a dilemma as well, and it's not a straightforward one, because it has implications on your access to funds, your access to donors. It has implications on your own mandate as an organization. If you're a human rights organization, for example, your advocacy work might cause harm to a peace agreement that is in the works or that is getting developed. And for you to cooperate directly as a human rights organization with a peace building organization might cause, might compromise your own work. So there are a number of dilemmas that are actually, they are real, and they are difficult to understand, and they are difficult to resolve. And frankly, you know, they're not straightforward. It's not just about engaging local actors. It's not just about bringing local actors and having them at the decision-making table engagement. It's how you engage them. It's about the expectations that you develop by engaging them, and ensuring that you've got the systems in place to follow through with that kind of engagement, because it brings responsibility. So what are the challenges? Now that we've gone through the dilemmas, what are the challenges? I think, and again, this is just for the sake of analysis, there are challenges at the local level for your engagement at the local level, but there are also challenges at the international and regional levels. And that's why I say, you know, you're really dealing with two political economies and not one. So at the local level, I think we always say, well, you know, you can develop good political economy analysis to guide your engagement. But actually, local political economy can be really difficult to grasp, even for national actors. And I'm not saying, this is not an argument in favor of, you know, international researchers coming in and doing political economy analysis. Far from it. But what I'm saying is that political economy analysis, you need to understand it, not at the national level alone, but also through recognizing subnational realities. One example is the conflict in Libya. The situation in the eastern part of Libya is very different from the western and very different from the southern part of Libya. They have different histories. There is, of course, a shared sense of identity. There are shared concerns, but the political economy and the needs and the power dynamics of the conflict are so different from one region to the other. And similarly in Yemen, Yemen's the different sub-regions within Yemen are different developmental stages and have different developmental capacities. So you can't come in with a strategy, or conflict sensitivity between quotation marks that looks at those countries as a single unit of analysis and that comes up with developments, peace building, humanitarian plans that do not take into account those subnational realities. And that exercise, understanding the local political economy, is quite a complicated one. Engaging with governments is difficult. That is also at the local level, it is a complicated process. And it's complicated because, again, government is not a single unit of analysis. It's about local authorities versus governments at the national level. Who do you engage? How do you engage with them? How do you understand the power dynamic between them, right? And there are a number of examples that maybe in the Q&A part of this of the webinar, I'd be able to cite more examples. But there are a number of examples where local authorities have been quite have had a different set of interests and dynamics are very different from national governments. And finally, also looking at war economies that are not just national, but that have been internationalized. Consider what's going on in Syria, Iraq, Libya. There's a recent article that you've probably all seen about Sudanese security workers who went to work in the UAE and ended up, woke up and found themselves in Libya, right? So, even the war economy is quite internationalized. And the local is very much regional, is very much international. They're all linked to one another. And then, the international and regional levels also bring a difficult political economies. You've got the competition over donor funds, which Rahma mentioned, and that happens between international actors, and there's also another level of competition for international and national actors. You've got high turnover rates and capacity problems in terms of operations at field level, but also very limited communication between what happens at headquarters and local level, right? And decision-making at local level is very different from headquarter level. And that's why a lot of people that you engage with will tell you, avoid trying to get decisions from New York, for example, or DC, because that you're opening a can of worms. It's so much more complicated there. And finally, and the discrepancy, that's the discrepancy between policy and practice. And finally, what I call false localization. There's so much so much policy making and so many meetings and conferences and convenings about localization and engaging local actors. But localization itself, even within conflicts, within the context of conflict sensitivity, has become false. And the problem with false localization is that it's dangerous because at a tokenistic level, you can say, well, I've got X number of local actors engaged in the development of this strategy, but you haven't really genuinely engaged them. You haven't really genuinely done conflict sensitivity. Yet you don't really understand the local political economy. So what you've done is, again, a tick box exercise, and those tick box exercises feed into one another. So what are the opportunities? And again, very quickly, I still see merits in conflict sensitivity, but I think there's a massive chasm between the aspiration to conflict sensitivity and its reality. I still think it's a low bar. I think what we should have is an immersion in conflict and a deep understanding of the conflict and of international engagement and its ramifications. And frankly, the knowledge, the data is there. It's not that we don't know about the adverse implications of lack of conflict sensitivity. It's not that we don't know of when things go wrong as a result of lack of conflict sensitivity. but it's a matter of really, you know, taking things forward in a meaningful way, and being genuine about accountability, being genuine about localization. And in fact, it is just not happening. So that chasm between aspirations and reality somehow need to be met for that conversation to be taken forward. I think COVID-19 has been an opportunity for us to reimagine what conflict sensitivity is. COVID-19 has been an opportunity because it was a time when international actors could no longer operate in conflict-affected contexts, where there was an increased reliance on local actors, and that's where, you know, localization became not a luxury, not something that you would do, but something that you had to do in order to ensure that your operations continue on the ground. And I think that there are opportunities for us to take that momentum and take that energy and feed it into conflict sensitivity, so that we have a revival, a reimagining of what conflict sensitivity should be. I think local actors have a much stronger voice, and that is so important. I remember about 10 years ago, I would get approached at conferences, and people would say, "Oh, it's great that, you know, that you're speaking. It's wonderful that somebody like you is presenting on this issue within the development sector." But now there's so many people like me, you know, who are not Western, who come from different countries, and who have a much stronger voice. There's also an interest in adaptive programming and approaches, and those may be a channel through which conflict sensitivity can be effective. UNDP has recently started, you know, adaptive management unit, and I see that there is an interest in a lot of the collaboration that we have with an international organizations, that there's an interest for them to ensure an uptake of analysis at the operational level. And that comes with a certain openness to be criticized, and a certain openness to understand that things can go wrong, and that you need to go and revisit your operations based on the analysis that is being produced. So that there is hope there for conflict sensitivity to be meaningfully integrated within those programs. And finally, there are massive shifts in global geopolitical trends. The taxonomy, the language that we use about global north and global south, and I've written about that, is no longer valid, is no longer, you know, it no longer means much, because there are massive geopolitical trends that have taken place that brought the world together. And there are new players, there are new donors, new NGOs that are proving to be important stakeholders and key actors in engagement. And I think that because of those factors, those are all opportunities that can have a significant impact on conflict-sensitive programming and the development of new models of engagement. So I will end there, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shireen. That was another, I thought, really great presentation with so many points that I'd love to jump straight into a conversation about. But I think now is a good time to hear from Ranga to add a third perspective here. And over to you, Ranga, sitting in the dark, I think.
Welcome, everybody. This is Ranga speaking from Juba. I think Tim has already introduced me, but because my name is difficult, maybe I just need to say it again. I'm called Ranga. I work for Safer World, but I work for a program called Conflict Sensitivity Resource Facility. Tim has already talked a bit about it. So I'll be delivering this presentation. So I'll provide an overview of conflict sensitivity, drawing from my experience with CSRF, or Conflict Sensitivity Resource Facility, which is a program that has been established by 4 donors to help integrate conflict sensitivity into their policies and programming in South Sudan. So just to go straight to my presentation. So the key question is, what is the current picture from South Sudan about conflict sensitivity? It is true that conflict sensitivity has become popular in South Sudan. There's been an increase in awareness, but also in interest in the conflict sensitivity, partly because of conflict sensitivity resource facilities work, our work from 2016, but also there might be some actors who have also contributed into that. So the concept, when we started, was a new concept to most NGOs, but now it's not really, it's something that has piqued a lot of interest. But of course, there's still some challenges. Aid agencies are still struggling how to put it into practice. And that's really the most important concern is for agencies that are with the headquarters in Juba, how to ensure that their staff who are based in the field are able to apply the concept. So this has been a consistent challenge that has been raised throughout. Another challenge is how to bring in local perspective into the discussion about conflict sensitivity, because it seems that the concept as introduced as a new concept is a foreign concept, if I may say. So throughout our engagement when we started, it was the facility engaging with donors and the implementing partners, which are mainly international organizations, non-governmental organizations, with little reach to local or national NGOs. So those are the two challenges. I know there are others that I will mention during my presentation, but of course I also want to say that some of my discussion, some of the points that I'm raising can overlap with earlier presenters, but I'll be able to tell you some of how unique they might be from you who are working from different contexts. So despite these challenges, CSRF has tried to address them. And one way that we did that was through institutional assessment and accompaniment. So those are some of the ways that we've done, like gone to donor offices and implementing partners and try to conduct assessment of their institution, how conflict sensitive they were. And after that, we come up with the plan to how to support them, work together with them, how to address some of the challenges in their institution, because there's been a lot of thinking that conflict sensitivity in early years was sitting with individual. So if we will be able to insert that into institution, then it will be sustainable. It will be long term and can be able to stay beyond the life of CSRF and others. So next. Yeah, so I will, based on what I've provided about the background on how we have moved with the conflict sensitivity on some of the progress that has been done, partly by CSRF, there are still a lot of challenges. And if I may go to some of these challenges, which I said might overlap with other speakers. One is emergency nature of our country, and the South Sudan has been in conflict for a very long time, and we know in 2013 there were, after we got our independence in 2011, just 2 years down the road, then we had an outbreak of conflict in the country. Then again in 2016, and as we speak, the peace is still fragile. So because of the fragile nature of South Sudan, the donor funding has been short-term, or has been heavily focused on humanitarian response. And that has been a bigger challenge that we had in the country. It has been a biggest obstacle to the integration of conflict sensitivity, because when you're in an emergency situation, normally there is a little interest to apply the concept, if I may say. Just to give you an example, in 2016, when CSRF was established, just few months down the line, then there was a second outbreak of conflict. So there was a little appetite that came immediately after the emergency situation resurfaced. And that's really common. Like normally, if I can quote one participant in one of the training, is that he had a humanitarian background, and he was saying conflict sensitivity is not really relevant for us because we are always in a rush to save life, if I may say. So it's difficult to convince people in an emergency situation to really implement or apply conflict sensitivity. But if I may say, CSRF has tried it best, because when, as I mentioned, that the facility was created, then the emergency situation set in, but we are able to demonstrate to the people that you can be conflict sensitive even in an emergency situation. And that was really gain ground, and we were able to conduct activities. And early years, from 2016, 2017, most of the agencies that were attending our trainings on conflict sensitivity were humanitarian. And that was really very interesting to mention that it has been a challenge, and we have tried our best, but still it can remain a challenge so long as the peace process remain fragile. Those who are monitoring South Sudan, you know that there's been a delay in implementation of the peace process, and that in itself creates a lot of suspicion on donors to shift to resilient and development-related work. In 2018, there's been a relative shift to resilient, but of course, donors are a bit cautious about the situation. So this is one challenge that I wanted to bring up. Another challenge is conflict sensitivity is a tick box exercise rather than a genuine problem solving exercise. Because when we have mentioned that there's been a lot of tools and manuals that have been, that have been written about conflict sensitivity, and there's been a lot of trainings about that. So there's been a tendency among those who attend trainings those who attend training to rely so much on the document rather than looking at it as a process that they need to engage with others, they need to learn, they need to exchange information. And that has been a problem. With us, we created some forum in the past where we were able to bring actors together to share information and benefit from each other. Another challenge is conflict sensitivity is an accessible or technical term. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, that is the term that still do not resonate well with those who work in the country, because there's been little attempt to ensure that conflict sensitivity takes into consideration, the context itself. Is a concept that is top down. That's a bit problematic. When we started CSRF was engaging with the donors and implementing partners, but CSRF attempted to reach out to national NGOs through mentorship programming. Then the last challenge is lack of appreciation of local knowledge and practice. This is really interesting because donors and agencies that we support also have local actors with whom they work. But in the beginning, like most of the training and conflict sensitivity information were centered around donors and implementing partners with local involvement of local actors. So the assumption is if you train a donor or INGO, that they will be able to coach those with whom they work. And sometimes that's not really true. Next. Moving forward, I've decided to summarize my point into three. One is conflict sensitivity should take into consideration local knowledge, local perspective, and understanding. And I think this is really real. There should be an attempt to engage, not only with national NGOs. There are many actors who constitute local actors, faith-based organizations and others, not only through working with them, but also generating discussion about what do they understand about conflict sensitivity, whether there is equivalent, a word that is equivalent to conflict sensitivity. So I could see that that might be a way to ensure that conflict sensitivity is really contextualized and it become a bottom-up approach. Another recommendation that I decided to put up is a new approach should make conflict sensitivity a joint responsibility for donors and INGOs, national NGOs, through opening spaces for sharing relation and information. As I earlier mentioned, that there was a tendency to ensure that conflict sensitivity sit within the donor and INGO arena with little involvement of local actors. So it should be a concept that binds everybody, that bring everybody together to share information. Local actors could have a lot of examples that could share that demonstrate the application of conflict sensitivity, but they may not call it that way. The last, there should be a shift toward problem solving and coaching as a way of putting conflict sensitivity into practice, or it should be more practical. And I really emphasize this because based on my experience is that agencies are still struggling how to put conflict sensitivity into practice. So there should be more room during conflict sensitivity training to ensure that the spaces are created for agencies to engage with each other and ensure that they really understand how to solve problems rather than impacting knowledge on conflict sensitivity. So there's more has to be done to ensure that conflict sensitivity is really moved further into that direction. Last. Yeah, I will stop here and I look forward to any comments or questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranga. Thank you, Shireen, and thank you, Rahma, for what I thought were three very interesting and complementary and challenging presentations. I think there's a huge amount in there. I'm conscious that one of my jobs as the moderator is to ensure that there's enough time for a discussion and for questions and answers. So whilst I have many that I could ask, I think I would like to open the floor to anyone who would like to ask any questions. And from a logistical point of view, what I'd suggest is that if you have questions that you want to put into the chat box, please do, and my colleague Alistair will kind of pick those up. Or you can also feel free to raise a hand if there's a particular comment that anyone would like to make. And maybe whilst we're waiting for some of that to come in, I'd like to just kind of throw something back to all three of our speakers, please. For me, listening to those presentations, there's a lot of kind of common threads, a lot of kind of common challenges that I could pick up on, but there's two that really jump out at me. The first was around the challenges or the tensions between the way that the aid system as an overall operates, and the kinds of incentives and challenges that that are built into the way that the aid system operates, and the reality of operating in a way that is consistent with the kind of principles and ideals of conflict sensitivity. Localization is something else that came through very, very strongly in all of the presentations. You know, there's a wealth of evidence and policy commitments from across the aid sector in supporting localization. Very much a part of what a kind of conflict sensitive aid system would look like. Yet the progress that we've seen towards genuinely, I think Shireen, you talked about false localization. The gap between the rhetoric on localization and the rhetoric on conflict sensitivity and the practice seems to be significant. And I think we've been hearing this in each of the examples that you've given. So I don't know if there's if there are any immediate reflections from any of the panelists on that question, and I can see that and then there are some other questions kind of coming through as well. Sorry, it wasn't really a question; it was more of just a comment. But does it spark any reflections?
Well, I can share some reflections.
Please, Rahma.
Yeah, I think really localization demands ceding of a certain amount of control that I think certain actors, whether it's donors or implementers, really need to cede, right? And that's a very difficult thing to do. There are many underlying biases and perceptions. Then there is the purely financial angle of it as well, because of the fact that the sector can be quite competitive. And I think those issues, without addressing that, it's very difficult to remain true to commitments against localization.
Go ahead, Shireen.
I mean, I think it's because the politics are difficult. I think political will and engaging in a conflict zone, it just comes with a lot of challenges. And I think that the existence of those challenges adds another layer to the disincentives that are there for meaningful localization to take place. That's one. And the other is the finances of it. I think there is competition. There are disincentives to localize meaningfully, because it means that you would lose some of the funds that you had access to, and funds now are becoming more and more limited. So those are the two realities. I think the politics and the finances really, really matter.
Sorry. Thank you, Shireen. Nay, I think you had a hand up. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Hi, I have a question for Ranger. And he mentioned about when situation is very fragile, especially in South Sudan, and people are more focused on humanitarian aid. In my opinion, addressing humanitarian issue is part of the conflicts, addressing conflict sensitivity. So, I mean, in your opinion, are they two different things, or are they kind of like somehow similar? Or why did you could you collaborate more about it?
Yeah, I will try, but maybe some of my colleagues will also help. Based on my experience, is that as I mentioned, is that when CSRF was initiated, immediately there was, CSRF became the main like champion of conflict sensitivity in 2016. Then conflict started. Before we began to spread the word about conflict sensitivity. So there was a bit of reluctance by some agencies to engage on conflict sensitivity because everybody was really like busy with the humanitarian work. But because of the advocacy that was done, there was, a U-turn, if I may say. Yeah, I don't know whether I've addressed the question, but I definitely say when you do humanitarian, in a way you could also be doing conflict sensitivity. It doesn't mean that really you can be doing humanitarian work. When you are doing humanitarian work, involve building relationship with the beneficiaries, maybe bringing people together who benefit from the assistance you are giving. Indirectly, you could be contributing into fostering relationship, maybe addressing conflict that happened between the people. But this is not how some humanitarian look at it. They see their work as purely to deliver assistance. It has nothing to do. If you unpack conflict sensitivity, then you get to know that sometimes you are really doing conflict sensitivity. Like the example that I've given with the local actors, that some of them actually are doing conflict sensitivity, but they don't use the word. They have their own ways of managing risk where they work. I will stop here. I don't know whether I've addressed that.
I'd like to just jump in if I may. I'm conscious that we don't have a huge amount of time before the end, the scheduled end of the session. So I'd like to suggest that if people are willing to carry on for a few minutes afterwards, I believe we have a small amount of leeway. Because we've got a few interesting questions coming in now. And the first one that I'd like to kind of throw out to the whole panel is around communication. We've got a question, I think, from Marlon. All the panelists touched upon the importance of communication and careful listening to the various communities. In your opinion, what kind of literacy is needed to talk and collaborate better with each other? I'm gonna maybe put, who shall I put on the spot? I'm gonna put Shireen on the spot first, because I think you made a very interesting and important point, I think, about the being aware of the need to follow through and have kind of genuine communication. So I'm interested in your kind of responses on that before moving to Rahma and Ranga.
I mean, my quick response to that question is that the kind of literacy that is required is a very simple one. It's being humble and just recognizing ignorance in the first place. And I think that a lot of people who work in conflict zones, who make their career working in conflict-affected contexts and conflict zones, forget that each context has its own specificity, its own traditions, its own customs, its own its own problems and its own political economy, as I was discussing. And so I think the first skill that you would need to develop is just recognizing what you don't know in order to start that process of communicating and trying to understand. I think the other thing is also departing from superficial communication. And I think that's a problem that we fall into, and it's a difficult one. I mean, even anthropologists or researchers who've done research and work in countries where they're not familiar with the language, they're not familiar with the history, and they're not necessarily familiar with the culture. It takes years and years to be able to deliver and develop that literacy, that level of deep communication that you need to get to. And so it would require that spending time understanding the history, understanding the culture, and trying to get to a deeper level of communication than the more superficial one. And finally, meaningful localization. You will not be able to understand everything and communicate unless you're willing to cede power and give up power to local actors and just give them the authority and the capacity to lead. That's all. Over to you, Kim.
Rahma or Ranga, did you want to come in on this? I could see Rahma was making notes.
I agree with Shireen. I think Shireen's covered a lot of what I would have said. I think it's about cultural literacy. I don't think it's about the necessarily about traditional literacy in terms of who can write and who can read, because the level of wisdom that sits with the communities themselves in terms of how they problem solve, but also the perspectives that they have, that is not something that should be taken lightly. And I think I also agree with Shireen on the part of humility. How that plays out in practice for me is sometimes we see a lot of very eager aid workers who want to be the ones at the forefront engaging with the communities directly, but they may not be well placed. And in instances like that, I would just say it's better to invest in local people who know the language and the culture and maybe go along and observe, as opposed to forcing a situation where everything takes 3 times the time because you've got people translating for you. You've got a massive convoy, security convoy, that's just attracting too much attention. It's just, there's so much that I think there is a need to be very sensitive about in terms of how you engage, but also to not become the focus yourself is quite important. If communities or people at the local level can forget that you're there, you'd be very surprised how honest of conversations they have. And then lastly, I think there's no point in having conversations for the sake of having conversations. So it's very important to be prepared to listen to the outcome. And sometimes, we're not often either able or prepared because we had no idea how different that was going to be from our expectations. And it may force us to go back and redesign a program or go back to the donor. And that can be, quite a bureaucratic process, but it's better to prepare for that and be willing to do that before engaging, which is the absolute best way to win the trust and the cooperation of any community that you want to work with.
Yeah. And Ranga, in your presentation, you touched upon the terminology that's used in conflict sensitivity, and probably not just conflict sensitivity, like across the sector, which makes me think about, we talk a lot about communication and language, but there's also, the accessibility of language and what do people understand by different terms can be quite different. And there was a follow-on question, which I suggest we don't get into in detail now, about what kind of local terminology and alternatives to this language around conflict sensitivity seem to resonate in in your experience? I'm interested, Ranga, maybe to put you on the spot on this question around from the experience with the CSRF, which is doing such interesting work in South Sudan on these topics. What resonates as a way of talking about these issues and engaging with different types of stakeholders on these issues?
Yeah, it's a bit a difficult question, but of course,
I gave it to you, Ranga.
Like South Sudan is like most countries, is a very diverse country. So there's a lot of ethnic groups and a different understanding of the concept of different words. Even conflict, the word conflict can be translated differently by different people. But of course, if we intend to understand how local people understand the concept of conflict sensitivity, then the issue of engagement comes in. This is very crucial. Of course, we deal, in my experience, we have been dealing with national NGOs and local NGOs, but are they really representative of communities? I know the assumption is local NGOs represent the communities, but if you look closely, those who run NGOs, like in South Sudan, people like myself, who are educated, maybe outside the country, then they establish national NGOs, they have little touch with the community. So like they are not really the right people who could really tell us what conflict sensitivity is in their own understanding. So it involves going further than engaging with local actors that we know, going down to the ground, talking to the people. And that has not, in my experience, we have not taken that step. It will be interesting to do that. But in our conflict sensitivity training, we did a small exercise of asking people, what does the word conflict in your language, what is the word conflict? So the people have been posting, and it is quite interesting, like explain what is that word. So sometimes it means disagreement. It doesn't really mean conflict like in English or violent per se, or could be a combination of both. So it's a quite complicated, and it will be interesting if we go a step further. Maybe just to run on the issues of engagement. In South Sudan, agencies are accused of not engaging enough with local actors. What do we mean by engagement? Does it mean going for 30 minutes, talking to people and running back to your office? In South Sudan, this is not engagement. Engagement means building relationship, means sitting down, learning long story, because people like giving context here. When you speak to someone, like normally when we do interviews, you say, I wanted to do interview for 45 minutes. But 45 minutes could be a discussion about background. When you ask somebody a question, maybe they will spend 1 or 2 hours giving you the contextual, the context before responding to your answer. So normally we don't engage enough with local community at the local level, and that can be a hindrance to understanding their words that really might be equivalent to conflict sensitivity. I'll stop here.
I am wary of being accused of engaging too much and taking more time than we have allocated for this session. We are now at the end of the time that we had. If I may, I'd like to just kind of just add one final kind of reflection, which I think builds on what Ranga was saying, and from each of the panelists here. I think the example that Ranga just gave there at the end about what engagement means in practice, the time to do that, the you know, whether it's sitting under a tree or whether it's kind of build, and Shireen and Rahma were talking about building those relationships that are necessary to really have that understanding of maybe not even understanding, accepting that we can never have true understanding, and we have a certain perspective and trying to broaden that perspective is really at the very heart of what conflict sensitivity as a transformative agenda means. For me, the key challenge, the wider challenge for the sector is how can we encourage, support, cajole changes within the way that the sector, the structures of the sector are set up to allow for that and to encourage that and incentivize that kind of engagement, that kind of collaborative approach, which is really fundamental for taking these principles and turning them into action. And for me, this discussion is a part of that, and and I hope it's the beginning of more discussions, more thinking, more engagement on this topic. I would like to kind of throw out an offer to anyone who's on this call who would like to know more or would like to kind of continue the discussion. We are always happy to, I'm certainly always happy to continue the discussion, and please feel free to get in touch if there are more questions or would like to discuss further. I am conscious that there were more questions that had come through, but and I'm being reminded of one question, but I think that we should probably try and respect the time and kind of bring it to a close right now. So for me, it just falls to thank Rahma, to thank Shireen, to thank Ranga for the presentations and for the discussion and sharing your time and your wisdom with us. I think it's important to thank the organizers, Eric and Nay especially, who have done all the kind of the background and getting this up and running and inviting us to be here. And Alistair, my colleague, who deserves special mention for really making this happen. Unless there are any final words of wisdom, I suggest we kind of draw this to a close, and thank you very much to everyone for participating.